Okay, so welcome to the metal tutorial. We're going to learn how to make a metal material from scratch. So to start with, I have a file available on Canvas that basically has the default male bust, the default female bust, a camera, and two lights on the floor in it. And the floor has the procedural sand preset as the texture. And that's because what we're going to do is whenever we're working with a metal, we want to have a reference. And so in this case, we're using the death mask of Tutankhamun as a reference for creating a gold material, and not a new gold, but a very old, aged gold. And you can see that, right, this is highly polished, but it's imperfect. There's lots of noise on the surface. You'll even notice that there's some green highlights. You know, look at the different colors, and we'll talk about this a bit. But the other thing when you're trying to recreate a reflective material, or any material for that matter, you have to be aware of the lighting conditions under which the object was photographed or under which the object is sitting, right? If it's in your actual, like if you actually have it in person. And so in our case, right, it looks as though with this mask, there's a light that's down here because we can see there's highlights here. There's highlights right under the lips, under the nose, and under the base of these snake and vulture heads. But then there's also highlights coming down from the top. So this is kind of a strange setup where this mask has been lit from below and lit from above. And so I've more or less recreated that in Cinema4D. Just to make things go a little faster, I did all of this work ahead of time. I want to talk a little bit about it, and then we'll get into the demo. So if I change my view out of the primary camera, and I have the interactive render region open right now. I don't know if that's going to be set to open when you open the project file. If not, we'll cover that in just a second. But so one of the things that we've got going on here is we have these two lights, and the lights that we've got in here are called area lights. We haven't discussed these yet in the tutorial, but they're really nice because they're the most physically accurate lighting that we can use for lights that would be in a space, including like light coming through a window, other things like that. But with that, the big difference with an area light and a normal type of light is that we can make these visible in the reflection. And when we're doing reflective materials, being able to have that light physically, the shape of that light visible in the reflection is really important, right? If it's the sun or something like that, it doesn't matter so much. But if it's if you have like a fluorescent tubes, if you have like round shaped lighting or whatever, you want to be able to have that shape reflected in the object that you're illuminating. And so area lights are really nice for that. They take a little longer to render. The other thing is that I've turned on the fall off, the physically accurate fall off, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will talk about later. And it just, again, creates a much more physically accurate light. And you can see this big circle is the light that's above that has a much larger fall off. And then the little circle is the light below that I needed to basically cram in between the floor and the mask in order to create that illumination from below. And each of the lights has a slightly different tint. They're pretty similar, but you can see one's a little bit warmer, one's a little bit cooler. And that's just, I did that just because these lights, the two lights in the scene probably aren't absolutely perfect either. So, okay, so we've done that. So if you do not have the interactive, I'm going to stop that. Yes. If you do not have the interactive render region on, if you click on this middle option here, click drag, you can either turn on or off your interactive render region. Once you turn it on, if it's not perfectly aligned with the male bust. Oh, by the way, I have the lights set so that they are as accurate as possible to illuminate the male bust right now. If we were working with the female bust, we can just either duplicate these lights or scoot them over so that they're aligned vertically with the female bust. It's up to you which one you want to use. So with the interactive render region, there's a few controls if we haven't talked about this before. First, if you hover over the edge somewhere that isn't one of these center points, you get a hand and that allows you to move that region around. If you do hover over some of these points, that allows you to change the size and shape. You can also click on the corner to control both dimensions at the same time. And then there's this tiny, tiny little arrow, and when it turns into a hand with a pointer, what this does is it allows you to control the quality of the interactive render. If I go all the way down low, then I get a really low quality but fast render. And if I go up higher than this middle point, then I get a much higher quality render. And I can go all the way up to full quality if I want to. Additionally, go ahead and click on the render settings. It should be set to the physical renderer. The physical renderer, and it should be set to low and adaptive. The physical render engine is slightly different, but it does these reflective materials a little bit faster than the standard render engine. And especially with the interactive render region, where we can adjust the quality here, we can get something to look at more quickly. Okay, so with all of that, we're ready to get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to create a material that we're going to be using to create this metal. And there's several ways to create a metal material. And so sometimes people will use the color channel and the reflectance channel. Sometimes they will just use the reflectance channel. Sometimes they'll have diffusion in there. And we'll look at a couple examples after we make this metal, just to see how other metals are made. And I'll point you to where those are, and then you can sort of explore what they did to make those metals. So if I go ahead and double-click to create a new material, and then double-click on it to open the material editor, we're going to start with this base material, and we're going to go through the method of just using the reflectance channel and the bump channel to create this metal. So first, we're going to just call this gold base. We're going to turn the color channel off entirely. We're going to go to the reflectance channel, and we're going to delete or remove this default specular layer. Right? That's sort of, the specular is like a legacy thing, and all of those effects you can do with reflectance, with these other reflectance layers. And so, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to add a new layer, and we're going to go ahead and use GGX. Each one of these has different settings. And so if I say select this GGX, and then if I go ahead and if I right-click on type and go to show help, when I do that, if you have the help installed, which you should because it's really helpful, you can see what these different, how these different algorithms process reflectance. And so you can see that the Beckman, GGX is a little bit less glossy than the Beckman. The Beckman and the Fong and Ward are probably the sharpest, and you can just sort of see what happens to materials as you increase the roughness. And so depending on what material you're modeling, if you can choose which one of these is the best option based on what your material looks like. Maybe the Beckman would be better for this. So maybe we can change it there, right? So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I selected the type when I created this, but I can change the type here. So I can say GGX, I can change this to Beckman to get something that's even sharper and glossier to start with. Now, the other thing when you're making a metal is there's something called Fresnel. And Fresnel is, in a way, it controls the color and the way that a material reflects light. And so one of these options down here at the very bottom is layer Fresnel. And so the first thing we want to do is open that up and go from none to conductor, right? A conductor is, does it conduct electricity, right? And a dielectric would be like glass that does not conduct. A conductor would be gold, silver, aluminum, right? Most metals. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on conductor. And then for the preset, I'm going to change that from custom I'm going to go to gold. You can see there's basically every metal imaginable has an option in here, a preset. So I'm going to go to gold. And you'll notice that already that's created a somewhat gold color, and it's slightly changed the way that it reflects light. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag this and drop this material onto this head. And when I do that, you'll see that this light looks pretty great. Hold on a second. Okay. So you can see that I've got this material, and you'll also see that the way I have my camera set, I'm not getting a lot of additional information from the background, right? Everything is really, really dark. But this is like perfectly shiny. And so this is gold in its purest form, right? There's no what's it called? There's no impurities in it. And so it's a very, very clean looking thing. This is almost physically impossible. One of the things we're going to do is we do need to rotate our view so we have a little bit, right? We don't want to be straight on with this. We want to rotate our view just a touch. So I'm in this camera, I have this selected, and I'm just going to hold the number 3, and I'm going to click on the head, and I'm going to rotate that view a little bit. And I might get even closer to his head. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and adjust the dimensions of this. So with the default settings, you can see that this is, right, incredibly dark. And that's because this gold is highly reflective, right? It's almost mirror-like currently, right? It's got only 10% roughness, and there's not a whole lot else going on the surface. There's no bump. And so we need to make some changes. But before we do that, I want you to notice that, right, these little highlights here on the chin and on the nose and up here on his forehead and down below, those are the reflections of those lights that we put into the scene. And so we are seeing those applied to the surface of this object. We can also see the reflection of the female bust kind of smeared across the surface of his face. And so we're going to leave the background the way it is with absolute darkness in there, but we're going to start making a few adjustments. So first, we need to adjust some of the ways that this is colored, right? Like right now, we've got our layer Fresnel that's adding some color to this. We could even adjust the strength of that, but we're going to leave it where it is. And I don't think opaque makes any difference. But we could leave that as it is. I'm going to leave it open so we remember that we've set that. And then we're going to go, and the next thing we want to do is we want to change the layer color for this layer. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create several layers to create some of the variation in tonal range. And so one of the things that you'll notice if we zoom in on this image here, is that we'll notice that, right, there is no truly black area on this. There's really warm brown reds in the darkest places on the mask, right? And so that's something that we need to do, is we need to make that adjustment. And so that's what our first layer is going to be devoted to. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the color here, and I'm going to make this warm, I'm going to find like a warmish reddish thing. Now what I could do also is there is an eyedropper here, and if I click on this, I can come anywhere on my scene and I can select a color. And so I've done that. And now, right, this whole thing goes really, really red. And one of the things about this layer is this is, right, we don't really want these to be our specular highlights, right? We don't want all of this redness in the bright areas of the mask. We want this redness everywhere else. And so to do that, one of the things we can do is we can increase our roughness. And I'm going to go ahead and set this, right, really rough. And so what that does is it spreads that color all the way across the entire mask, right? And so now I'm kind of getting this nice base brown tone that I can build on top of. And so, and I've got the brightness set to 100%. I'm going to leave, if I want this to be brighter, I can increase my specular strength. so that the light, right, continues to improve here. Okay. And so I've set my specular strength to 50, the roughness to 83%. That's a roughness. We could make adjustments later. But so we've started to get some browns in there, and nothing is, even in the super dark setting, it's not incredibly dark in there. But this is a good base. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to add another layer. We're going to say add. We'll do a Beckman again. And when we do that, right, immediately it overlays the entire thing and we lose all of that color, right? And so the first thing to do is we say, okay, layer for now. We want this to be a conductor. We want to make that conductor gold. And when I do this, you'll see that now I'm starting to get something a little bit more interesting, right? It's not perfect, but I'm starting to get something where I do have these dark red areas that are being overlaid by these gold areas. But what I want is I really want this to be more pronounced in this area, and I really want it to kind of obscure more of that brown. And so part of the way I can do that is if I increase the roughness. And wait a certain amount of time. Right, I can start to get something where now you can see there's these edges, right? There's the areas where it's really, the highlights are sharper, where the highlights are less sharp, and then I get this nice gold brownish tone in here where there's a little bit less lighting. And similarly over here, I might need to adjust my lights. They're a little narrow, so I might want to make those broader so that I get more of the head evenly illuminated. But that's something we can adjust in a little bit, and it doesn't really matter while we're starting to build this base material. Now I would say a roughness of 50% might be a little bit steep, so I'm going to drop that back down to 38%. And this way now I do have these gold areas are a little bit sharper, but they're still not quite exactly where I want. In the end, what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 layers. And so you will notice, right, even on, like, I am starting to get this area in here where, you know, I've got some highlighting here, but I've got these darker areas on his chin line, and the nose is pretty well illuminated. Again, I think that what I need to do is actually make my light a little bit larger in shape in order to hit these surfaces a bit more evenly. And maybe I need to adjust the position a touch. And put a big bearded thing, chin beard on there. Okay, so I've got these 2 layers, and right, we're doing this with the interactive render region so that it more quickly makes these changes. I could even go with a lower quality at this point, because really I'm just trying to do wide swaths, and I really want this to go quick. So I'm going to go down until it's a reasonably fast thing, and I don't need quite as much of this window as either. So if I shrink this down, knowing that really it's everything from his chin, if I'm happy with what's happening on his face, then I'm happy with what's happening in general for the rest of the thing. And so, okay. So now I've got this set. And so now what I need to do is I need to create a 3rd layer. And we need to figure out, there's a couple different ways we could work with this, right? We can do add, we can make certain things brighter or less bright. We could say maybe this brown's too dark and we need to boost it up, but let's get all our layers together and then we can start making those changes. So I've got some of these yellow highlights, but you'll notice that one of the things that sticks out in this particular, you know, mix of gold and whatever else is in here is that there are highlights that are green. Right? There's this greenish cast that comes over a lot of the object. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a 3rd layer. I could also, right, if I know that I want most of these settings, I can also go to copy and paste and get a 3rd layer that's identical. And then I can go ahead and make some adjustments. Now, oops. So something I haven't done yet in this, even though I'm getting this gold appearance from the layer Fresnel, is I need to add a layer color. Right? I want this to be, right, this is a really kind of rich yellow. And so instead of this really pale yellow, that's just this pure gold that we're looking at. So if I go to my layer color, I could either go in and find one of these colors that I think is about where I want it to be. And maybe this even area here is like kind of that mid-range. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a color from here and hit OK. Right? And so now I've got kind of the reflective qualities of that gold, but overall I have a much yellower color. Now, something I could do is I could, it looks like it's a little intense, so I could either reduce the brightness of that layer color, or I could just come in here and in the saturation, I could just desaturate it a touch and hit OK. Right? And that's going to, when it renders again, that should make it a little bit more pale. I'm actually not seeing any change whatsoever. So maybe I need to make it a little less intense here. I could also adjust the brightness of this layer here. And if I do that, you'll see that it's going to allow me to bring more of that brown in, which I don't really want to do. I actually want this to be 100%. And I just really want this maybe to be even paler in color. That might be a little bit too much, right? So this is something where we, where you do experiment, right? You have to go a little bit above and below. I'm going to go right in the middle of those two values, and that should be pretty close to where I wanted it to be. Right? Yeah, it's a little bit more gold now. But now you'll notice that as I'm getting here, right, there's some browns, there's these richer yellows, and maybe I need a little bit more richness in there, but we'll figure it out. But what I'm missing are some greens. And so I'm going to go ahead and make another layer, but to do that, rather than like having to redo all of these settings again, I'm going to go ahead and select layer 2. I'm going to hit copy. I'm going to hit paste. And once I've pasted that additional layer, all I'm going to change to start with is the color. And I'm actually going to choose something pretty green, like, you know, somewhere in this green zone. And when I do that, I'm going to get this like intensely green overlay that gets applied to the entire object. And that's not what I want. And there's ways that I can start to make adjustments to this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change the mix mode on layer 3 to add. Right? And you'll see that one of the things that it does is it, right, now it changes, so it's a more subtle blending between the two. I also, in this case, want to boost this roughness up a little bit more, because what I'm wanting is I want some gold, some green halos over this. And as I'm working on this, it's really just like too green for me right now. So I'm going to try a couple things. One of which is to take layer 2 and, oops, sorry. So I'm going to try a couple things. The first thing I'm going to try is, you know, I could adjust the percentage, you know, that this blends with, right? And you can see that that might be an effective way to adjust it, right? Maybe I need it to be just a little bit less. Let's see if we try like somewhere around 30% what we get, right? Okay. So with 30% selected, this is one of the ways that I can make this adjustment that is going to allow me to have this greenish cast, but not have it be overwhelming to the layers that are underneath it. Right? Something else I can do as an experiment is I can take layer 2 and I can drag it and put it on top of layer 3. And when I do that, right, I'm going to get a much different appearance, right? But if I increase this layer 3's intensity, you'll see I can bring some of that back. So I have a couple different ways that I can work with this to get this to look nice. Now, the last thing I need is, right, we have some of these highlights on here, but what we really need are, we need some of the sharp clean, glossy look that's on the top of this. And so we're going to add one additional layer. And we'll make it a Beckman as well. We'll just keep these all the same. And with this one, I am going to go down to the layer for now and choose conductor and gold. And when I do that, now what starts to happen, and I might adjust the intensity of this here a little bit, right? But I get some of these like really nice, sharp highlights in this tonal range, but I also have everything else that's happening underneath. And what I may do is change this to add, and we'll see what happens there. So now I've got, right, because I'm doing add, everything else is coming through, but I still have these sharp highlights, which, you know, look pretty pixelated because we're doing this at a pretty low resolution render. But I've still got everything else happening. And I might adjust this brightness, but what I'd like to do first is actually go ahead and just render this. But what instead of rendering it in the picture, or rendering it here, I'm just going to click here to render it in the picture viewer. Because I want to be able to see a higher quality render of this. And this is going to take a little bit of time to handle. But you can start to see how some of these highlights are adjusted. I'd say the highlights are a little bright right now, and part of that could be that I can reduce the intensity of the light that's hitting it. The other part is that I can also decrease the brightness of that final layer that I added on there. And I really want to see the eyes, and then we can go on. Right. And so I'm starting to get something that maybe that brown isn't coming through enough. So maybe the green layer and the layers above it need to be a little less bright. So that I get more of that base brown in there and not so much of the green. And then, right, at this point, this material is still very polished. And so I need to be able to adjust that level of polish. And that will actually take a break and do a second tutorial for. But let's go ahead and make a couple more adjustments to make sure some more of that brown comes through. And I am not going to, I do want to stop it. So maybe I can switch layer 2 to add and just see what happens there. If I do that, more of the brown comes through, right? But I'm starting to get, you know, more illumination on the ears and things, and it's still looking a bit green. And so it may be that layer 2, either we need to make this more reddish in its yellow, like between yellow and red, or we need to reduce or increase the brightness of this a touch. Let's see what happens if we do that a little bit and see if we get, right? So now we've got more of those browns starting to come through, right? Which makes it look a little richer. I think we need a little less on our green, which could either be reducing the roughness of the green layer from 61%, let's go down to 50. Right, so we have smaller green halos, but now that orange-red is coming through a little bit too much. So let's switch this back to layer 2 to normal and see what that does. Right, that brings things down significantly. So for the sake of time, I made a few changes, and now I'm going to tell you what those changes were. And this is because it's always an experiment, right? It's always something where it's not like, oh, this is the perfect level for this material. Right, so I moved layer 3 here. It's set to add. Currently, it's at 73% brightness. The roughness is 49%, and the specular strength is 20. Layer 2, which I think is still a little bit intense, has the roughness set to 62%, the reflection strength to 76%, specular strength to 6%, right? And that's that color green, or sorry, that yellow color. Layer 1 I've increased the roughness to 95%, and I've reduced the specular strength to 11%. Right? And so we're getting there. I would say that layer 3 is still a little intense, and I don't know what's the best way to reduce that intensity, whether it's to reduce my specular strength a little bit. That seems to help, but also I think the roughness needs to be a touch more refined. There we go. That's a little bit nicer, right? Now I'm getting that green just around the edges, which if I look here, right, it's there, it's kind of spread out in certain areas, but in most places it hovers right around those bright highlights. And then I think leaving it at 73% at this point is going to be pretty good. I wish this was just a little bit more gold yellow, and so maybe what I can do is go to my color here and actually go back up in the saturation a touch to 45%. And that made, a subtle change, it looks like, not too much. I could increase that some more if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave it right where it is right now. And so where we're at, I might want to decrease the roughness on this very final layer to maybe 5%. And let's just see what that looks like, right? So what that's going to do is it's going to make these specular highlights sharper and just make the whole thing look glossier overall. Okay, this is a good spot to stop. Let's go ahead and save our work. All right, so we've created a base gold material that's perfectly pure and clean in terms of surface qualities. And now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make this have some of that variation on the surface that our reference has, right? There's squigglies and all sorts of smears and stuff. It looks like people have been touching this more than they should have, right? And it's, it's older. It's not a perfect surface. And so we're going to go ahead and in the next tutorial, we will start tweaking some of those settings using the bump channel and some other options that we've got.